and they present Paula Crowley, who will do our introductions for today.
Okay, well, thank you, Julianne, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final lecture on our course, Space. We've had, I think, an outstanding series of lectures on topics really covering a lot of different areas: SATCOM law, the James Webb Space Telescope mission, exoplanet discovery, space junk, and space tourism. So our final speaker today, whose topic I think fittingly will encompass all of the transformational changes occurring in the space market and industry, is Bill Gattle, who is the recently retired president of Space Systems for L3Harris Technologies. His business has sometimes been called Sensors Are Us because it has everything from advanced sensors and payloads to ground processing and information analytics. And it's been a leader in hosted payloads on other satellites as well as small satellites. He has also been quoted in the space media as an expert on the direction of the space industry. Bill holds bachelor's and master's degrees in mechanical engineering from the University of Florida, and he is a graduate of the Harris Leadership Directions Program at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. Bill is also a board member of the National Space Foundation, UF Dean's Advisory Board, and Astronauts Memorial Foundation, and is a recipient of the Outstanding Alumnus Award from the University of Florida. Today, Bill will be speaking to us about his work with L3Harris, a company that has more than 60 years of providing highly reliable launch avionics and communications technologies to projects from early spacecraft through Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Space Shuttle, the ISS, and Mars missions. L3Harris has also supported deep space exploration with work on the Hubble Space Telescope and now the James Webb Space Telescope, and worked with the United Launch Alliance in providing avionics and communication equipment critical to the launch of the majority of Amazon's Project Kuiper satellite constellation, whose mission over a 5-year period is to bring a high-speed broadband service to remote areas of the world not reached by traditional networks. So with that, I'd like to welcome Bill Gattle, whose talk today is New Space, the Generational Transformation of the Space Market and Industry. Welcome, Bill.
Well, thanks, and I appreciate you all joining me today. This is going to be a fun topic. We are in the most amazing time in space, and so I welcome you to the talk. I hope that I'm going to be interesting for you, and we'll give you quite a bit of a breadth of what's happening. So you've had a lot of information so far that I would call niches within the space market, but what I'm going to try to provide for you is what's important in space right now. You see a lot of things in the media, you hear a lot of things in the media, you hear a lot of things happening. So what's this all about? Why is it happening this way? And where is the market going? And I'll talk to you about some of the challenges that the space industry has right now, because they're very significant. So I've been in the industry about 30 on and off, and again, I've led the space business, but I will tell you, this is the most dynamic time that has ever occurred in the space industry. It is the most transformational time. And I'll walk you through why that is, but it's been pretty phenomenal to see what has happened. And you see parts of it with the SpaceXs and the launches. And you just saw a Dragon capsule come and splash down in the last 24 hours. You see all these things, but there's a lot behind it that I think is interesting to talk about. So that's what we'll do. We are in the transformation from what I would call science and engineering into critical infrastructure and into something that makes space a new frontier, a true new frontier. And you're seeing it right in the middle. This is a slice in the middle. We haven't arrived yet, but there's things that have to happen. Just like when they were exploring the West, when when America was being formed and people were going across over to San Francisco and other places, there was big transformations, like when the trains got put in, because it created interconnectivity. It created a way that things could be moved around. That's the state that space is in today. We're trying to move it from what I would call just exploring things to making it mainstream, to make it infrastructure, to make it really something that we can leverage as a human race to be much more than it is today. So that's what's happening. So I'm going to walk you through basically how this change has taken place, what we're up against, and where it's going. So I'm going to just go to the next slide. So basically what's happened is, for the first 50 or 60 years of what's happened in the space market, it was basically what we used to call the land of science and engineering. It was basically exploring things and wanting to find out what's around us and what was it like outside the bounds of the atmosphere? And what could we do different that would allow us to get outside those bounds? And if you look at that, a lot of it was, could I put a man in space? So we did the Apollo missions and we got the Apollo missions going. It was a huge 10-year journey that we had with President Kennedy and all these different things that happened. But it was really about exploring, and it was all funded by the US government. We also started to take a look at what's in deep space. How is the Earth formed? How is our universe formed? We took a lot of places about the origins of man. We took a lot about what's happening in deep space. We all these different constellations, started realizing we're just this little speck in the universe, right? So that was a big deal, but that's where science was. That's what we were looking at. And over time, what happened was it became realized you could see things from space you could not see from air or sea or ground or terrestrial. And so we started to put up satellites to look at the Earth and passively monitor what was happening. We looked at trends. We looked at weather trends. We looked at climates. We looked at oceans moving. We looked at ice melting. We looked at all these things. It was all passive, and it was all just an engineering trade that was being done. It was characterized by 90% of the funding or more was coming from the US government. If the US government wanted to do it, industry would go off and do it. It was science-based, and much of it was passive. It was just, we were looking for things, we were exploring things. That was kind of an exciting time, but the reality was we hit the year 2000 and space transformed. Now, you may not have seen it in the year 2000, but in the year 2000, commercial entities started to come online. You would know it as DirecTV or Sirius XM radio or somebody like that showing up. And what was amazing is you would go to their launches and they put all their money in those launches, and they either lived or died. They were either all part of the company growing the next day, or they were all fired because the launch didn't work. It was literally live or die on a single event of a launch. And so what happened was you started to get the commercial feed of it, and that started to change things. The other part that started to happen was once you started to get things like, oh, my TV comes from space, oh, my radio comes from space, my weather comes from space, people started to realize that space was not just an interesting place to explore, it was in critical infrastructure. If I didn't have space, we used to call it a day in the life of space. If you didn't have space, you couldn't see the weather in the morning. You couldn't hear your favorite radio station. You couldn't get to where you're going because GPS didn't work. Sometimes GPS doesn't work even now, but it still is, you couldn't get to where you needed to go. And so it started to become critical infrastructure, and people started to depend on it. And so that's what happened in the 2000 to 2010 era. And then what happened was all of a sudden, commercial space launch became cheap. You had an entrant called SpaceX come in, and they, instead of selling rockets for $150 million a copy, started to get down to the $60 to $70 million copy. They completely disrupted the market where United Space Alliance and United Launch Alliance was dominant. So it used to be all this government stuff. Now the commercial guys cut the price in the market in half. And that completely changed what happened. So now all of a sudden you get explosive growth. People are going up into space for either national security, commercial, all kinds of ventures. And the influx of dollars has been tremendous. The commercial industry spends 3x what the US government spends in space today. So it's 3 times as much money per year goes into the space market from commercial people versus the US government. So the US government no longer rules the roost. The US government may say, I want this. And commercial will go, well, maybe I'll give it to you, maybe I won't. And we'll talk about how that looks, because it used to be the US government, when they'd come out and do a contract in space, everybody bowed down and said, oh, whatever you want, whatever you want. Well, that's not true anymore. The commercial guys are now influencing the entire market. So with all that's going on and all these space satellites going up, space has now become congested, which there's a lot of satellite stuff and satellite parts, and it's contested, meaning people want to know if I can get up there and my system will work. And so that's what's starting to happen. So that's just a quick overview of what's happened in the markets. Let's talk about some of the critical events getting here. I mentioned a few of them, but one of the first ones is some of the major events along the way, and what built momentum is, first of all, when we had a huge thrust in this country, in the US, to go to the moon in the Apollo era, it showed that there was really neat stuff that could happen. And it showed that we could overcome major obstacles in space. So what the Apollo arrow showed us is, hey, we can put people on the moon. That is not an easy thing to do. But as a nation, we're smart enough, we have the technology enough to put humans outside our own atmosphere, and we can do it successfully. It was a huge deal. That, we think back, it's a long time ago today, 50 years or so ago, but still, you look at that, that was a major transformation for us as a nation to say, space is accessible for human beings. And so it was pretty amazing. Then you go to the next step, which will, could the world collaborate around space? And so the space station came in. It became a collaborative effort to where everybody in the globe got involved with space. That was another big thing, because now everybody started. The next step, and those first two steps were sort of a necessity, but they didn't really launch what you have today. So what happened next is launch became cheap. And two ways it became cheap. One way is they cut the price in half to launch space vehicles, to launch a rocket. The other thing they did was, and especially it started with SpaceX, you could hitch a ride on somebody else's rocket on a ring below it. And you could, so somebody else would, if you will, would buy the main building, and you could build a little condo on it, on the rocket, and get your stuff up there for a fraction of the price. All of a sudden, everybody's hitching rides with, so you have a main launch, but SpaceX is selling all these little tiny small sats and all these other satellites to hitch a ride with it. And they get up there and they get dispensed, just like if you remember those old Pez dispensers where you just kind of dispense a little candy. That's what they do. They shoot these little satellites off that little dispenser. And it's a little ring that they shoot these little satellites off of. That changed what could be done financially. So all of a sudden, I could launch a satellite for $1 million versus 70 million, just because I hitched a ride with somebody. And that's something L3Harris has done. We hitched a ride on a Indian rocket from India, and literally we could buy a spot on the rocket for under $1 million. That is cheap in space terms. So then what happened is everything was point to point. If you remember the old Rowan and Martin Laughlin, and she would put the little, she'd connect one phone to another phone with one wire, and that was it. You were just like connecting. That's what space looks like. It goes from ground up to a satellite, back to the ground. That's what it's a point-to-point system. That is not conducive to a marketplace or anything else we have to do. So now we're building a mesh network. We're building a network of communication so you can get real-time communication. Before that, everything was stored on board, and when you get over a ground site, download whatever the picture you've gotten there, the weather satellite, just download it then. But you're going to store it until you get over someplace. The mesh network is what is being worked today, and it's what's going to transform the market. And so if you think about Jeff Bezos and some of these other people, they're basically saying we're at day one of the space industry. We're just now building infrastructure. It's like building FedEx or UPS delivery. It's building the logistics backhaul. Jeff Bezos has said it many times. Amazon could not be successful if UPS and FedEx were not there. He had to have infrastructure. Same thing with space. If a communication network is not there, it's not going to work. And so that's why there's so much focus today on communications. So let's go to the next chart for a second. I mentioned this early on, but commercial investment is 3 times more than the US government in any given year. From 2019, and actually if you go back, it's probably back to about 2014 when SpaceX and others really started to crank up their investment. Just in the last 3 years, since 2019, the amount of investment has gone up by 61% in space. That is a very large compound annual growth rate. This makes this market probably one of the hottest markets in the world. It has more money going into it. It has more billionaires associated with it than almost anybody else. You think about Jeff Bezos is there, Elon Musk is there. There's a lot of billionaires sitting inside the space market that aren't doing this because they just want to see some interesting space junk fly. They're doing it because they're going to leave a legacy. These are the pioneers of the future. Just like the pioneers went, to discover America, these billionaires are looking at this as legacy creating. This is something, if you've talked to them, which I've talked to quite a few of them, they are all about creating something that will leave a lasting legacy that will last for decades. And they view it as pioneering something that's so important to them. And so that's kind of what this whole thing looks like. If you look down at the bottom of the chart, we had more launches last year than we've ever had in the history of space since 1967, which is the highest in history. We sent 14 civilians into space. That was more than any other previous combined, all the years combined, more went up last year in space travel. And we think, well, yeah, hey, it's interesting, but this is transformational. This is something completely different than we've ever seen. One of the things you're seeing in this market is that the commercial companies are not depending completely on the government. Recently, SpaceX won something, excuse me, called the Moon Lander. The Moon Lander is just like you remember back in the Apollo days, that vehicle that would come down and land on the moon, take an astronaut and land them on the moon. They bid $2.9 billion for that lander. They viewed it as they're going to Mars anyway. If they can get the government to subsidize their trip to Mars for $2.9 billion, more power to it. Well, the Lockheed team, along with the Blue Origin team, bids almost $6 billion. So SpaceX basically said, I'm going to donate $3 billion to this venture in order to be the player. But they viewed it as just, it's just money from the government that's helping them get to where they were already going to go. It's just an adder to what they were already going to do. That has changed the financials of this business completely. How long can you bid straight up as a company? You cannot go head to head. You're going to invest. If you want to be in space, you as a company are going to invest. When I ran my business at L3 Harris, we literally were investing $70 to $80 million a year to continue to pay, to continue to be part of the mission. We used to call it pay to play. Eventually you will make money at it, but early on you're going to pay to play. And that's what people are doing, because the commercial market, it's just like anything. If you want to start a product in a commercial market, you're going to have to invest in a product and then you can sell it. But if you don't invest in it, it's not going to happen. And that's where the market is very different than it was before. So let's talk about who the players are, because this is an interesting dynamic. I put red squares around people who are what I would call the change agents. There's many people that you hear about, but not all are change agents. And not all companies are change agents. I'm going to pick the comparison we have right now, which is a pretty obvious one. SpaceX has a brand right now. They are the hot commodity, right? They are the brand of the really neat things. They're a young, vibrant company. If you listen to them launch a launch vehicle, listen to the people who are on that call. They're late 20s, early 30s. They are very young and vibrant. They're very excited. Now go listen to a United Launch Alliance launch. They sound stodgy and traditional. It's just a difference. Look at the cool spacesuits that SpaceX has. They're all white and neat looking and cool. If you saw the dashboard, if you will, within the space capsule, it looks like a Tesla car. It's really cool looking. It's not all those old dials you remember and all those little knobs and switches. It's a cool looking space capsule. It's what you would expect. It's what you've been seeing in the movies for the last decade. It's really neat. They have that brand. They are also have shook the entire space industry by taking a different approach. Not just that they're commercial. They've taken the approach that everything is trial and error. Failure is good. That is the way they view it. I've partnered with SpaceX and I competed against them. I went out to Texas. They have their launch facility out there that they used to use, where they were putting a rocket up in the air to see if they could have it come back down and land in a very remote spot. And Elon Musk and Gwen basically said, this is dumb. Let's just see if we can land on a ship in the sea. That's where we got to be anyway. Why are we playing around in Texas? Why don't we just go out to the ocean and see if we can land it? So the first time they did it, the rocket tried to come down and land on the barge, and it nicked off the side. It fell into the ocean. What happened? The traditional media and the traditional space people said, see, they failed. SpaceX went, cool, we hit it. Of all the places in the ocean that could have landed, we nicked the side of that thing. We're close enough, we're gonna get there. It's just a completely different mindset than the space market knew. So they're used to failing. They're okay with failing. Their satellites, all the Starlink satellites you hear about, not all of them work. their success rate is like 95%. They're creating space junk right now. But that's the mantra of their company. If you compare that to a Boeing, Boeing is not doing as well in the space market because they are a very traditional company and everything has to be analyzed to death. You have to analyze everything. You have to build models of everything. SpaceX doesn't work that way. Just launch it, see what happens. We'll learn from it. We'll learn more from the reality of it than we will otherwise. If you look at Blue Origin is a company that is built off of Amazon. They basically have a phrase that uses that they move forward very slowly but ferociously. That's their mantra. The problem is they've moved too slow. So SpaceX has beaten them to market. So Blue Origin hasn't launched really anything yet. They're still building stuff. When they do launch it, it will work. I know it will work because that's just the Bezos Amazon look. It's the reason why when they introduce something on Amazon, it always works because they make sure it works. You don't want a SpaceX version of Amazon because it probably won't work. It's not, it'll have bugs. But Bezos with Blue Origin and Amazon, it's going to work. The problem is he missed a major recompete of rocket launches. The government came out about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and said, I'm going to put out a contract for the next 10 years of launches. Well, Bezos hadn't launched anything, so he missed the whole thing. So his delay has caused him not to be the player that he could have been in this market. There are many companies that are starting to make this transformation. L3Harris did. Northrop Grumman and Lockheed has made the transformation. And a little company called York is building an entire constellation of small communication satellites. So that's what this thing looks like. If you look on the right-hand side, this is the government. These are the players in the government. If at the top, Frank Kendall, who's head of the Department of Defense, he is a player. He is really looking for how is the US government going to spend its money? Are they going to spend it on commercial or are they going to spend it on the US government? Dedicated assets. There's a bunch of other people. You hear about the Space Force. The Space Force is setting up a new branch of the military. Even though you would think that they're right in the middle of it and leading it, they're not. They're spending most of their time getting uniforms, getting training their new people on space. They're not the player you think they might be because they're just struggling to get a new force set up. So people like Kendall is a big deal. But part of the Department of Defense is on the lower right. There's a guy named Andrew Cox. He runs the Space Warfare Center. He basically designs the future architecture for the United States of America, Department of Defense. So he is a player. He's just not being heavily decisive today to say this is the way it should be. So that's frustrating industry. So what industry is doing is they're just going off and doing their own thing. If you look in the lower left of that red box, Dr. Derek Tournier, he set up, there was a Congress went out and said, we're going to set up a new agency that's going to do space different for the government, called the Space Development Agency. He was hired from me. He was my internal research and development guy. He has now become the head of that agency. And he basically has gone out and he's going to do things differently. He is getting companies to invest huge amounts of money, including L3Harris, in building out infrastructure for the government. And he's launching on timelines that are much shorter than anybody's ever done. And so he is a major player. But what's going to happen in the next year, by the end of this calendar year, his organization is going to roll under traditional Department of Defense. And so the big question is are we going to lose all that creativity and agility when it rolls in to the Space Force? And nobody knows, but that's a huge watch item. And then you have the National Reconnaissance Office, and Dr. Troy Mink, which I know very well, he is a big mover and shaker when it comes to how national defense is done and how national intelligence is done. So these are the players, and this is what's happening. But I'm going to talk to you next and run through a few things about what does this look like in terms of these people? What are they shaping? So these are the people who are shaping it, but what in the world are they trying to shape right now? So let's walk through a few of these. First of all, satellites aren't what you think they were traditionally. So satellites used to be these passive devices. And what they looked like was they had two major parts. The first part was what we call a bus. The bus itself is what you would think of as a bus driving you around town. It is literally the thing that drives you around the orbit. It allows basic health and maintenance. It gets you to where you want to go. It drives you around. It reorients you. That is what the bus does. It is not a smart piece of equipment necessarily, but it powers what we call the payload. The payload is what's actually doing a mission. It's communicating, it's taking pictures, it's doing weather, it's doing something. It's doing something useful. And so what's happened over time is the bus portion has become a commodity. So these companies are all building buses that they're trying to drive the cost down, build commonality, and they're basically finding a niche in the market that they can sell their bus so that other people will put payloads on it. And so that's what's happening. You have a lot of small companies building buses, these things that drive you around. And they vary by how big a payload you're going to put on it. You're going to put 1,000-pound weather satellite on it, or you're going to put a 100-pound communication satellite part on it. They size them depending upon what that mission is. They vary the life of the mission. So it might be a 1-year life for that satellite and then it burns up or dies, or it could last 15 years. Different power, anything from a very small amount of power all the way up to 20 kilowatts, which is what Lockheed Martin has with their A2100 bus. And they're trying to figure out how much reliability you need. So reliability is a huge deal. Reliability comes in the form of, are you radiation tolerant? When you're in space, you can get hiccups and it will cause your bus to lose where it is. It forgets where it was launched. It forgets where it is in the orbit. And so how radiation tolerant you are is a big deal. So that's sort of the traditional satellite. But now we've got satellites that have rocket engines on them. And so sometimes they're called propulsive satellites. And they come in 2 different flavors. The first flavor is you can actually, that ring I was talking about, that little circular ring that you have on the bottom of a rocket that you send out these little satellite, small sats, like Pez dispenser, that ring can actually become a satellite. It looks like a flying saucer. So if you look over on the left-hand side, that ring over there on the lower left of that picture is like a little flying saucer. And off the side, those little things that look like plates, blue plates, those are the solar arrays to give it power. But that thing can fly around. It can move around very easily. It has rocket engines on it. So it can move around, which means it can move from orbit to orbit and it can move from place to place. And that gives it some special features. It also has a lot of power on it. So it's basically a circular satellite. They used to be big boxes right up on the upper top. Now you've got this thing, it's a flying saucer satellite. On the bottom, we all remember the shuttle, but you've probably seen the X-37B too. These are reusable satellites because satellite just means it's orbiting around the Earth. So these are just planes, look like a plane, that basically are able to carry a payload, and then they're up there for a few months, a year or two, and then they come back down and they get repurposed and they go back up again. So these are the types of, so they're no longer just, if you will, static satellites that are doing station keeping. They're actually able to move around. They're actually able to fly back down to Earth. And a lot of it has to do with how maneuverable do you want to be. If you remember, the Russians just launched an anti-satellite missile, within the last year or so. Well, if you want to play dodgeball and you want to get out of the way of that missile as it's coming at you, you might want to have a propulsion system on there that can get you out of the way. That's what some of these other ones can do that the ones in the top can't. So that's why they're doing these kind of things. The other piece of it is, how reconfigurable is it? Can you reprogram these satellites? In the past, they had one trick. It was a one-trick pony. You'd launch them and that's all they could do. And if you wanted to upgrade something, there was no way to upgrade it because there was nothing reusable. Now you can have reconfigurable satellites. You can actually send up new software. You can send it up. It's like we used to call it an angry iPhone. You could actually have like a phone and put a new app on it. Just like hey, I think I'd like to try a new application on my iPhone. You just download it. That's what you can do on satellites now. That was not possible in the past. They were fixed. You couldn't actually change what they did. So this is where this thing is going. Radiation, though, is a big deal in this lower right. There are physical constraints of what we do. There's something called the South Atlantic anomaly. This is where the Van Allen belts, which are charged particles around the Earth, are the closest to the Earth. We had a small satellite that we built, and every time it would go through those belts, it would have a hiccup and reset because the radiation was a significant impact. There's been lots of satellites that go through that belt and just can't withstand the charged particles. The Van Allen belts are also between low Earth orbit and some of the outer Earth orbits, and you have to harden against it. So that's what they're doing with these satellites. All right, so that's a long-winded, what does a satellite do? So let's talk about orbits for a minute. So if you're not familiar with orbits, there's a low Earth orbit, which is something that ranges from about 350 to 1,000 miles above the Earth. That means that the satellite will orbit around the Earth about every 90 to 120 minutes. So it goes around. So it's not static over a location of the Earth. It's just going around the Earth every hour and a half to 2 hours. It has benefits because you're closer to the Earth. You don't have to have as strong a signal to see something on the Earth or talk to something on the Earth because you're closer to it. But you also don't get the coverage. You're sitting there looking at this massive object, the Earth, right in your view, and you can only see parts of it. So if you want to see a lot of the Earth, you have to launch a lot of small satellites because you don't get the view. There's something called middle Earth orbit or medium Earth orbit. This is something that travels around, it orbits about every 12 hours around the Earth. This is where the GPS satellites are. So there's 24 GPS satellites that are going around the Earth all the time, and they hand off one to another. But they're sitting in that orbit, in the middle Earth orbit. That happens to be where all the radiation belts are. So those satellites are highly protected against radiation. So if you think about your GPS signal, that thing is sitting out there 12,000 miles above the Earth and is susceptible to radiation. That's why they're radiation hardened. GPS is not just for locating, just so you can find your way to the nearest unknown location. It is really the clock for the world. All financial transactions, everything goes through a GPS satellite. We build that, by the way, but that was kind of a cool thing. Now, geosynchronous is 22,000 miles above the Earth. And it means that the satellite is over a fixed location on the Earth. So as the Earth rotates, the satellite stays above a single location. And that's a highly beneficial, right? So if I want to be always over the United States broadcasting my direct TV signal, I want to be at geosynchronous, so I'm always over that same location. I don't want to be drifting over Asia when I'm trying to broadcast my direct TV. I want to always be over the United States. Those spots at the geosynchronous orbit level are sold. And they are considered a very large financial asset because every one of those positions is over a specific location on the Earth. And so if you own that, you own it probably for 10 to 15 years. And if your satellite starts to struggle or dies, you have to get it out of that orbit so they can resell that slot above that country. The geosynchronous belt is primarily at the equator. So it might be a little bit angled, but for the most part, it sits at the equator. And if you look at the rest of this, so you have the Lagrange points out there around the moon. Those are points where the force of the Earth and the gravitational force of the moon are balanced. And so the satellites can kind of sit there and almost use no fuel when they're sitting at the Lagrange point. So this is, you think about, well, there's a lot of stuff going on here, but for the primary missions we've seen over the years is the US has primarily been from the geosynchronous belt, 2,000 miles above the Earth, all the way to Earth. That's where most of the satellites reside. But in recent times, in the last 4 or 5 years, you hear a term called cislunar, which is anything between the Earth and the moon. Now you're starting to see satellites out there in those areas. And that's a big deal because if you're the military guys, you want to know where everything is in the world and in the universe. That's a large space that you have to figure out. You've probably heard that Chinese have landed on the dark side of the moon. You've probably heard that the Chinese have stuff on the dark side of the moon. That makes a country like the United States nervous because there's a lot of space out there. We haven't really gone that very far beyond the geostationary belt for most of our satellites. But that's what people are looking at. And they also view it as that's the step that has to happen to get to Mars. So, all right, so let's talk about the most fun thing, which I know you've already had a talk on, so I won't spend a great deal of time on it. But debris is a huge deal. So this is the other area that the industry and the market is struggling with. So we've launched about 12,000 satellites into space, and about 4,000 of them, almost 5,000 of them are still operational. That means 7,000 or 8,000 of them are sitting out there as junk. Okay, so they're just floating around. That's a big concern for us. And it doesn't matter if they're a big satellite or it's a little particle, the whole momentum thing or mass times velocity. If something's traveling at 15,000 miles an hour and it hits you, I don't care if it's the size of a penny or the size of a truck, you're going to know it hit you. So that is what's happening, is these little particles, if they get in the way of something, can severely damage satellites and human life if it's the space shuttle. You've heard the space shuttles had to, International Space Station, it has to move out of the way, right? It had to reorient because there's debris coming through. I've launched stuff out of like New Zealand. In New Zealand, there are periods of time for hours, literally 3-4 hours. You can't launch because there's space junk in the way. You can't get through the atmosphere. You can't get up there. You have to wait till the junk flies by and then you launch. So this is a serious issue for what's happening in our world. And now what you're seeing is SpaceX is launching hundreds of satellites per month. OneWeb, which is another company that also launches, is launching hundreds of satellites. These things are becoming, and they're in low Earth orbit. They're right next to the Earth. They become debris, in essence, if they begin to die. It used to be that SpaceX and OneWeb flew high. They flew 500 to 1,000 miles above the Earth. And the reason why they did that is because they didn't need as many satellites. If they flew a little higher, they didn't need as many. Well, the FCC and the government came in and said, you are creating trash. You have to fly lower or get yourself out of orbit when they die. You can't just leave this trash up there. So now they've moved down in orbit to about 350 miles, and they're having to get, at the end of life, shoot these satellites out of the orbit because they're creating just so much debris of satellites that aren't working. So that's a policy change that's happened. Remember the geosynchronous belts, that's out at 20,000 miles. When those satellites die, they kick them out farther. So they go out to 28,000 miles above the Earth. It's called the satellite graveyard. Well, there's a bunch of old satellites. You think about, you just look at the numbers. There's 6,000 satellites sitting out there in the satellite graveyard. And it's just junk floating out there. They have to get out of the geosynchronous belt because that's a very valuable piece of property. But they're sitting out there. And so what do you do with them? And so this has become a major problem. It's also a major problem when you think about that debris out there beyond the geo belt. That becomes places that satellites may be alive and may be dead, and things can move around. So the military cares a lot about what's happening out in the satellite graveyard. They want to watch that graveyard and make sure they understand what's out there. So debris is a big deal. I know you had a whole lecture on it, so I won't go much more of that, but that is a huge deal for us as a country. The next piece of it is where I think the good news, if you will. We've got to create a communication network. If space is going to open up and become a real valid domain, we have to open it up to where it has communication real time. You can't make a call and then have it not be real time. You can't track missiles if it's not real time, because we certainly wouldn't want a missile coming from North Korea towards America and we lose contact with it, and it's like, oh well, that's too bad. We'll see if it comes back in 20 minutes. And by that time, we have a problem. So what's happening is there's numerous missions right now that have to have connectivity. So the first thing you have to look at is, what are you connecting to? These are called terminals. So you might be talking satellite to satellite. You might be talking from a satellite to a moving vehicle, whether it's an aircraft or a ship or a plane or a car, or you're just talking to something static. The most easy thing to talk to is something that's not moving. So if you're a satellite operator and you want to talk to something, you really would like to talk to a ground terminal that's not moving. But that's not helpful, because I really want to talk to things that are moving. Like I want to talk from a satellite to an aircraft. I want to talk to those things. Right now, I think you probably know that the only way we talk to them is through broadcast. So when you're on JetBlue or somebody like that, and you get your cool little thing from them about live TV channels, you're just getting a broadcast from them. You're not having a lot of two-way conversation. You can talk through Wi-Fi, but it's delayed. It's stored. It's not real time. So it goes, but it does. You might be able to do email, but you're not going to do a lot of video on those. So what's happening is you have to know where you're talking on the terminal. The second thing is, what are you trying to move? How much data are you trying to move? So the easiest way is your bus. This is the thing that drives you around the orbit. It wants to know where you want to go. It wants to know its health. It's going to tell you if it's healthy or not. Those are just direct up and down links. Those are just maintenance and health care for the satellite. Those are fairly easy. So on one end is a fixed terminal on the ground, and on the other end, your satellite's moving. Pretty easy. The second way is what is happening today with Starlink and some of these others. If you think about, you're driving down the highway and you're in a line of cars, and it's easy for you to talk to the next car or to see the next car because relative to you, it's not moving really. You're keeping a fixed distance. It's not sliding around or doing something. You're in line. So if I want to talk to it or shoot a signal to it, or I have a two-way radio, it's easy for me to talk to it because it's right in front of me. It's not changed. So that is a lot easier to do. What's really hard is things that we call out of plane, where they're both moving. So this is like I'm going in one direction and another satellite crosses me going in another direction. It's very difficult for me to get the signal to them. Or worse, I'm traveling in one direction on the highway and there's another car going the other direction. For me to point at it and talk to it, like I have to do with an antenna, I have to aim the antenna at it. It's moving so fast, I can't lock onto it and then talk to it. So that's a big problem for us. So the reason why people like SpaceX are creating the Starlink network is because everything's in the same plane. They're all in a relative sense, they're fixed. They're all moving, but in a relative sense, they're right across from each other or right behind each other. So they can talk to each other very easily. They can point their antennas at each other because they're not moving out of plane. They're all in plane. And that's what's so critical. And we'll talk about why that's important. So right now, almost everything is in plane or up and down links. Almost nobody does out of plane communication. It's very difficult to do. There's two types of communication. One's RF frequencies, which you've probably heard of. And they range from UHF all the way up to V and W bands. The higher the frequency, the more difficult it is to aim the antenna. Beams get narrower and narrower and are very difficult to aim. In the worst case, you're using a laser. In that case, it's very difficult to align. You have to get a line of sight with them. So those are the ways they're going. Lasers are really cool because they're secure. You're not spraying a signal in a wide range, but they're very difficult to align. The only way to really do it is if you're in plane, you're doing plane to plane. And then there's encryption. Do you want to have no encryption where somebody can tap into your links and change something on your satellite? Do you want standard commercial encryption? Or do you want network encryption? Do you want NSA certified encryption? All those exist, but the money goes way up and the link speed goes way down the more protections you put on it. So why is all this important at all? The reason why people like SpaceX exist and OneWeb and those kind of people, there's a belief from a business perspective that if I own the network, I will own all the missions. So if you think about, if I own this network, if everything's interconnected, I'm Verizon, I own the network, then I can sell you all the apps on Verizon. So if I own that network, that Verizon network is now gives me the ability to sell other missions, gives me the ability to sell other apps, gives me the ability to sell other services. So that's where people are going. So SpaceX, that's what they're doing. They want to own that network. And if you want to put a picture taking satellite on it or a weather satellite on it, you can tie into their network and use their bus, and you're tied into their network. That is a business strategy that's very lucrative right now. And the other piece of it is what level of encryption do you really want? So are you willing to trust our United States government? And all of a sudden a missile gets launched from North Korea towards us. And we have to have communication. Do you want that going over a Starlink commercial satellite, or do you want it going over a more secure network? Starlink would tell you they are a secure network. But that's the debate that's currently going on is, do I trust that level of network? So right now you have companies that are betting their future on this. Lockheed Martin, for example, believes they are building the 5G network in space. They would like to do that. They're doing it for the Space Development Agency, but they want to build that network so that they will own a 5G network in space. And if you want to have your mission on there, you just buy one of their satellites and you tie into their network. So it's kind of it's a very dynamic market when it comes to the communication. This is why this is so important, is why so many people are investing in this network, because they truly believe if you own the network, you own the future. Just like a Verizon or an AT&T or wherever else. If you own that network and you are the dominant player, everybody will have to come to you and use your phones and your ways to do things and your mission. So let's talk about the other one. This is another area that is like networks. And this is spectrum. This is the frequency bands that have to use. So there's only certain frequencies, if you look at this chart up in the upper right, The brown is where the frequency won't go through the atmosphere. It gets absorbed by the atmosphere and you can't get through. There's only certain bands of frequency that get through the atmosphere. Those happen to be very highly contested bands. If you look down at the United States frequency allocation chart and look at all those different colors, those are all the people trying to share the exact same spectrum. So your cell phone coverage, your phone in your house that's a wireless phone off a little handset, all the different things that you might have for TVs or analog TVs, any of that stuff, they all share the exact same spectrum. So spectrum is huge. So it's a limited natural resource. By definition, there's only certain frequencies that can go through the atmosphere. So the satellite people fight for that blue area that I've got in the square red. And they petition for it. And they try to get policies for it. And the people who control this allocation are the number one agency is the International Telecommunications Union, which was chartered by the United Nations. And then each one of the local nations have their own versions that report into the ITU. So the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, as well as the National Telecom and Information Administration, they both report into the ITU, one for civil and one for military, but they have to fight for these allocations. If we don't keep these spectrums clean, then everybody's talking over each other and all you get is jamming, either intentional or unintentional. And so what's happening right now is they take the frequencies, they want the filters to make your frequency that you're using very tight. It has to be very, very narrow because they don't want you to spray your frequency or have spillover in other people's bands. We as a company, the L3Harris, got fined for going outside our band, our frequency band, because we did that one time. It was by accident, but you can't do that. You cannot go out beyond this. This is a natural resource that's highly sought. And right now, the terrestrial cell phone 5G networks are competing with the satellite networks for these bands. And so this is something that if you can figure out how to fit more data, more information in a given band, it's golden. It's the holy grail. So people are constantly trying to figure out how to make the bands narrower and narrower and how to make them more packed. So if you look at this thing, there's just so many frequencies that are all on top of each other. And I gave you sort of where the shared frequencies are for these different frequency bands between satellite and terrestrial usage. And you can see that they're going to be over each other in a lot of areas. And we just have to make sure that we aren't jamming each other. At any given time, a commercial satellite, what they call transponders, which are their antennas, 10% of them are being jammed unintentionally all the time because of this overlap. If you think about you're looking up and you're talking to a satellite from the Earth with your ground station, it is possible that you're talking to that satellite and you may have it slightly misaligned and you could be jamming the satellite next to it and not even realize it. So those are the big deals right now. So I'm going to change gears a little bit. I got a couple more slides and then we'll wrap up and I'll answer any questions you might have. Space is very important to our world. I mean, I mentioned it's obviously you use it every day with GPS and navigation. You probably look at the Weather Channel and you see different weather satellites. Very important to you. It's also extraordinarily important to our military. And so if you look, I did a few quotes. These are sort of the famous people of quotes, so the people who I've known for years. So General Hyten, he basically came out, it was about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. He said, basically, if I don't have space, I'm fighting in the 1950s. I can't do anything without space. Jay Raymond, he is the head of the Space Force. It's basically, they believe it's the foundation of warfighting. And why is that? The reason why is because all our guided missiles, all our weapons use GPS. All of them use signals that go to space. The Chinese would say, and for America, that space is America's Achilles heel. Because if we lose space, we cannot defend ourselves as a nation. So that's why this has become so extraordinarily important. It is impossible for us to defend our nation without space. I'm going to use one example just because I think it's an easy one. I'm sure some of you have heard about hyperglide vehicles. You've heard Russia has a hyperglide vehicle. Recently, they've been threatening to use it. China's got a hyperglide vehicle. These are vehicles that do not act ballistically, which means it doesn't go up in a nice arc like that green line you see. In the green line you see that on my chart, as it intersects the darker blue sort of shaded region, that's where our radar in the United States can see the ballistic missile and see it incoming and create protection for us. The red line is how hyperglide vehicles work. They go up to they barely get out of the atmosphere, and then they glide through the atmosphere to its target, and they can't be seen by radar right now. So that's a big deal. There's no way to see them from the Earth because the limb of the Earth gets in the way. So the only way we can get to them is through space. And so space is now trying to figure out, how do you see these gliding vehicles that aren't very bright? It's like trying to find a 60-watt light bulb against the background of the Earth. How can you see it? And so that's what companies like L3 Harris and others are trying to figure out, is how do you do that? That is why space is so critical. Without it, you aren't going to see this missile coming at us, and you are not going to be able to track it. There's something called anti-access area denial, which means you can't get to those areas without being from space. It's also sometimes called the tyranny of distance. As you look at what China builds out in the China Sea, and they build out farther and farther, they build those islands, you can't get our ships and things close enough. The only way you can see it is from space. And that's why space has become such a critical part of our fight, because we can't get close enough to these countries. The only way you can get to them is to fly over them. And so the only way you can see what they're doing. The other piece of it, so that's sort of what they're doing. Today, the Space Force is focused almost completely on protect and defend. How do we protect and defend our assets? Because right now they're vulnerable. We didn't assume that people would jam them from the Earth. We didn't assume that space would be a warfighting domain. And so many of our satellites are vulnerable. With a Radio Shack $50, you can jam a satellite. It's just too easy. And so that's what we're trying to protect against. They're also looking at the second piece, which is over on the upper right. Space has become a warfighting domain. And so they want to be able to control what's being communicated. So these are things that are from the ground. They're basically the ability to jam another person's satellite. So you can trailer these things around. They happen to be built by L3 Harris, but you can trailer these things around and you can jam somebody else's satellite. Or you can look at the spectrum and see what is being currently broadcast to an area. This was a very big deal when the uprising in Africa occurred a few years ago, because you can stop communication in a region through these systems. And the last piece is, you want to make sure that no matter what happens, you have the situational awareness you need. You cannot be blind as a nation. You can't lose a missile for 5 minutes. You can't lose what's happening in the world for 15 minutes. You have to know. You have to be ubiquitously looking at the Earth. And so that's why we need all these space situational awareness system missions. And so as you look at this, almost everything that the DoD, the Department of Defense, is doing is trying to look at, how do we create an architecture that's resilient and it can protect our nation. And it has to be there, otherwise we're in big trouble. And it's everything from communications to imagery. You used to have heard of the kill chain, which is find, fix, track, target, engage, and assess. Those are things that the military does. That's what they do for a living. You have to have satellites that can find things, that can fix on them, track them, target them, in some cases engage them, and then assess the battle on it. And so that's what a lot of billions and billions of dollars are going towards right now. All right. So on a more positive note, I'm going to talk about the future, and then you might have. So what does the future hold? Quite honestly, in space right now, hopefully you got the impression it's super critical infrastructure. Right now, it's all about, how do you create connectivity? So everything you're seeing with Starlinks and OneWebs and all these different things that you hear about, all the stuff that Elon Musk is doing, it's trying to create the infrastructure for the United States and for the world and for future exploration. And so the question is, who's going to own it? How many Verizons are we going to have? How many AT&Ts are we going to have? So are we going to have a commercial version of a network that you can talk to and you can hook up your computer to, and you can talk through a space asset and it will communicate around the globe? Will you trust that for warfighting? Will you trust that when the military needs to do it? Will you go on a commercial network? Right now, all three of these are occurring, and all three are being funded. Commercial is being funded heavily. The US government is setting up their own networks through the Space Development Agency, and warfighting is also occurring. So there's also secure, highly secure networks. The advanced EHF system which is this network that our country uses. It's a satellite. It basically is there for nuclear war. If nuclear war breaks out, it is nuclear hardened and will allow us to communicate. How many of those networks do we need? Do we need them? Or can you just assume that there's going to be so much other networks that it'll be okay? So that is really fundamentally in the near term, the next 3 to 5 years, that's what's going to be defined. What are the standards associated with connectivity? The next piece of it, which is running in parallel right now, is artificial intelligence and machine learning. So we're trying to figure out how to track things, identify things, do indications and warnings. You can think of indications and warnings as, how would I know if Russia's going to launch another anti-satellite missile? Now we happen to, I can't go into a lot of detail on this kind of call, but we at L3 Harris, we knew it was going to happen. We knew it was going to happen several days beforehand because we could see indications and warnings of what's happening. We can do the same thing with North Korea. You can see this stuff happening. And it's because you're monitoring with machine learning patterns of life. You can see what's normal and you can see what's abnormal. You can see when they're doing something that, hey, something's going to start happening, when they move troops, when they do things. Those are all things that artificial intelligence is working on today, but it's going to go way beyond that in the future. There's so much data being collected. We also use it for climate change. We use it for what's happening with stars. We look at all kinds of different things that are happening in our world that we use artificial intelligence and machine learning. I gave a presentation for UF on that before, of how we're using it in space. The last is, there's going to be all kinds of new missions that are going to come. How humans interact with space is dramatically changing right now. It's just really dramatic right now. We're going to set up colonies on the moon. We're going to have new businesses arise. We're going to have tourism. We're going to do deep space. And it's all being fueled not by the United States government. It's being fueled by commercial. So this is just day one of what's happening in space. And hopefully I was able to give you at least some perspective of, this is probably the most transformational time, but we're building out infrastructure today. We got to get through that in the next 3 years or so. And once that happens, you'll see the next explosion in the space market. So the last thing I would tell you is, space is where the pioneers reside today. The pioneers of old, which we remember all the people who were, who would go off and explore. The billionaires are exploring in space right now. They're investing. So it's just a huge marketplace. It's exciting for people like me who built probably the most capable small sats ever built in the world. We left a legacy. So even though my career is not still going, I've left a legacy in my company. I've left a legacy in the government and in the nation of building satellites that are just phenomenal for what they do. So all these people are we all believe we're doing something special. So the possibilities are endless. I mean, it's really amazing what's happening, but the transformation is real and we're living it right now. I used to tell the people who work for me is don't be so busy that you don't see what's happening around you. Space is seeing an enormous transformation, and it's been an honor to be part of it. And so hopefully I was able to give you at least a glimpse into it. I'm going to stop sharing and then see if anybody has any comments or questions or rebuttals or anything else. Let's see. I saw a hand raised. I got to figure out how to deal with that one. Let's see here.
Thank you, Bill. Very, very informative lecture. Really appreciate the thorough discussion on what's up there in orbit around the Earth. It's really sort of mind-blowing. I don't think most of us really have a concept of how much is up in our space just around Earth, and how complex it is up there. So I guess a question I might have is, so when you're talking about mesh networks, so are we talking about an individual companies or countries network system, and there are many mesh networks up there, or are we looking at trying to develop one global mesh network, or do all of those turn into this global mesh network, all of those cobbled together?
So the reality is right now they do not play well together. So everybody, it's kindergarten. Everybody's taking their toys and playing with in their own sandbox. They're not all playing well. So what's happening in the market is there are probably on the order of 5 competing networks, mesh networks. SpaceX is the most well-known because everybody sees Starlinks, and if you're out late at night or you're out at night and you look up and you see those line of little dots, shiny dots, those are all satellites in a line with SpaceX. The first time I saw it, I was like, oh, there's aliens, but it's basically these lines of satellites that are up there that are communicating. So SpaceX is in the lead. The next one, OneWeb's putting up things. That's another small commercial company. The Space Development Agency is funding a government version, and there's some classified versions as well. So there's 4 or 5 different networks, and the question is how many do you need? And so it becomes, how many Verizons do you need? They all serve the globe. They don't serve just the United States, except for the dedicated US networks. So a Starlink will serve the entire globe. So it's going to come down to 3 or 4 is my guess, but it will be like Verizon. You can sign up for Verizon. I can start up for Starlink, or I can start up for OneWeb. It's just my network, and they'll be able to figure out how to talk to each other, probably through terrestrial means versus in space, because they're all at different orbital altitudes, right? So it's very difficult to do these cross links if you're not in their mesh. The other thing that mesh means is it's self-healing, meaning if I lose a satellite, it can reroute me to someplace else. In the olden days, when you just had a satellite up there and it was just a point to point, you couldn't reroute. if your satellite went down or a link went down, you're not talking. The mesh networks allow you to reroute the signal just like you do on a cell phone. You lose one cell phone tower, you'll hit another cell phone tower. You don't lose your call just because you move away from one tower. It reroutes you. So if you're on the highway and you're talking for 30 minutes, you've probably hit 7 or 8 cell phone towers in the meantime. And it's rerouting you and you never see it. So that's the other power of a mesh.
Okay, thank you. We've got a few hands up. Bob, go ahead. Bob Birdseed.
If space is not completely limited, there's all these satellites and everybody's playing with their toys in the sandbox.
Yeah.
Eventually you need some sandbox rules.
Yes.
Where would that come from? Is there any limitation to what a private company can put up in space?
So there's several things that you have to get. One of the biggest ones is the spectrum. So I can control you because you can't talk when you put your satellite in space unless you get a spectrum allocation. So that's the first step, is I can make it so you can't talk to anybody, so you won't put your satellite up because you can't talk. So that the first one is the spectrum allocation, is the policy that guides. The next one is you have to select the position of orbit that you're going to be in. You just can't throw your satellite wherever you feel like it. You have to get approval for the area and location you're going to launch your satellite. So that comes through the International Telecommunications Union, as well as the FCC and others. They will tell you where you can go and where you can put the satellite. If you just throw a satellite up there, there's big fines about if you don't know where you put it or you got lost. That's bad. You can't do that kind of thing. So that's what's controlling. Now they're getting into policy. So you're getting a lot more policy things, like you just saw I think it was the United Nations as well as Space Force came out and said, and the EU, the European Union, we do not support having any kinetic weapons in space. So you're starting to get people come out policy-wise about what's allowed in space. The reason why kinetic weapons are bad is because they create all kinds of debris, right? When an anti-satellite hits a satellite, it sprays thousands of pieces of debris like the Russians did. That's horrible. You just create a boatload of debris. So it's really coming out of these large policy organizations, the ITU, the FCC. Major governments are now doing it, and the militaries are now creating policy. But we're early. We're very early. There's still a lot of crazy things you can do in space and get away with it. So it's still the Wild West. They haven't created all the rules yet.
Thank you.
Shirley, go ahead.
Bill, you have blown our minds, really.
I hope so. I hope it's fun, at least. So I hope it's not scary.
We have no knowledge of this stuff, at least our regular day-to-day. We have no knowledge. You keep on introducing the idea that there's politics involved and potential war and AI up there. Do you sleep at night, or where is the end game on this?
It was strange. There are times when it is challenging. When in my business, and then I still have security clearances and things. When I saw we had the ability to know things about Russia and the Ukraine, and those kind of things are scary when you can see it coming and it's there, and you got indications and warnings of this buildup. Those are worrisome things. You sit back and you think, man, is there something more we could be doing? And I think what's driving a lot of us who have national pride and we've loved space is you realize the power we have in space. But the question is how do you make it more useful? How do you get it to a place where it really can be making a difference? We could see the Russian buildup. We could see everything was happening. We knew they were going to invade Ukraine, but you felt powerless, right? There was a powerless feeling associated with it. So yeah, it's difficult because of these different things you see. We in L3 Harris were very big on tracking missiles, and so we know what other countries can do to America. So those keep you up. At the same time, it's balanced with a huge sense of possibility. I mean, of the things that can be, that we can create. It will get better. It will take years. It'll take us to probably 2030, but it will get better, and we will make a difference, and we will make the world a safer place. Most of us in the space industry are driven by this sense of legacy, of making the world safer, making you safer. I don't know if you saw like the hurricanes that were hitting, Houston a couple of years ago, and you could see all the little sub tornadoes inside the hurricanes, and you could see all this detail that came from the people in Fort Wayne that worked for me. They built all that, and they see that and they go, we're making the world safer. We now know. In fact, at the time, we knew when tornadoes were coming through Houston, and we were working on the James Webb Space Telescope down there, and there was a time when we had to get our people from the Houston Space Flight Center to the hotel, and we were looking at our satellite images and going, go now, you got 20 minutes. That was those are the kinds of things that give you goosebumps, and you're just like, I kept my people safe because of what we did every day. But at the same time, you see these crazy things that are happening. So it's a big balance. It's very similar to me of the pioneers that went and explored the West. There was, the ladies that had to be in, they had to give birth inside a covered carriage and all that stuff. At the same time, they were doing something exciting. So they had a really painful time. At the same time, they were doing something that they felt was really exciting. So that's the balance. I mean, that was probably a longer answer than you were looking for, but it was just a phenomenal time right now in space.
Thank you so much for sharing. We worry about your mental health and the stress you must feel about all of this.
My wife does too. She worries about my mental health. But
Yeah, Bill, I think you may have a harder time retiring than you think.
It's a fascinating, like I said, good news. I get quoted a lot in space journals and things like that. I also was on my claim to fame was the Fox Business News I was on, but it's a fascinating time, and many of us are just feeling like we're just really honored to be a part of this time period, and this time period we can shape something. And it has changed us. It's like life in general, right? How agile are you as a human? How much can you learn? And I give you all a lot of credit for being on this call, not just to hear me, but you're learning. You all don't have to be on this call learning, but you are. You want to expand your knowledge base. You want to stay recent. You want to stay relevant, and that is a huge part of what this is about. It's space is all about how fast can we change and how can we make ourselves different than we were. We used to be a company that was traditional and stayed, but we morphed ourselves. We completely transformed ourselves, and that's what this is all about. And it's just a blast. So
you are fantastic. You're a lesson in life. You are.
And I think you could also be we could use you as a commercial for the ILR, I guess, going forward. That was great. That's who we are.
I'm willing to help in any way I can. To be honest, I really enjoy this. This is, to be honest, it's I wanted to be part of either the ILR or the Leadership Institute and things like that. So I'm practicing on you all. So hopefully the practice was good enough and you didn't get bored. But that's what this thing is. I think there's just so much excitement in industry right now for space, and there's just so much, no matter whether we're retired or we're still working, that we can learn, and it's a great thing.
All right. All right, I think I might just follow up with one final question, and then we'll let you go. I do appreciate your time. I was curious, I don't know how much you can tell us about this, but what do you think are the major thrusts right now in the defense side of things for the US? And I mean, is it mostly about communications, or are there other things in the space defense that are front and center as far as what we want to invest in. And then how far behind do you think we are from both China and Russia?
I'll do the first. So the first one, communications is required. So that's why it's being built out. We talked about that. The second piece of it is, how do I protect and defend the assets I have? The United States is dependent on a lot of what we call national technical means, NTMs. They are very important assets in the world and for our government, and they have to be protected. And many of them were launched 10, 15 years ago where they are not protected. And so the big question for them is, how do I know that satellite is safe? How do I know that somebody's not trying to do something to it? How do I know it's not being jammed? How do I know that it's not being cyber attacked? Because how do I know what's coming off that satellite is real? How do I know that in a wartime, somebody can't just take that satellite offline? So a lot of what they're focused on today is, how do I protect and defend? The next piece of it is how do I build an architecture of the future that allows me to put up satellites that are safer, that they can maneuver, that can get out of the way of an anti-satellite missile, that can do what I need it to do. So they're revamping the entire architecture. That's what Andrew Cox is doing in the Space Warfighting Center. How do I build an architecture that's resilient? And what orbits do I put them in? I mean, are they low Earth orbit? Are they a geo? Are they middle orbit? Are they as a whole combination? And so they come out with different things. How do I protect GPS? We're so dependent on GPS as a world. If you lost GPS, I mean, you can't do any transactions, you can't do banking, you can't do anything, and you can't defend yourself. So a lot of what's happening right now is the re-architecting of the, and right now they're targeting, so how far behind are we? You know, it's, China can do things right now, and so can a lot of countries do things that we have a very difficult time protecting ourselves against. Hyperglide vehicles are the biggest threat we have to our nation. If they put warheads on hyperglide vehicles, those things can get to us in 20 minutes and hit targets in the United States. And we probably don't have the ability to fully defend ourselves against it. So that is the number one challenge. And you can read about that. I don't want to go too much farther in there because it's fine. But have to protect ourselves against that particular threat. It is the biggest threat that we have. You know, when Russia says it's going to do a hyperglide vehicle, it doesn't have a nuclear warhead on it. It's not going to come all the way to the United States. China can get to the United States. Okay, so it's those kind of things. There's a lot of things that China has basically, I can't talk a lot about them, but has shown us that they are capable of, that we don't have a defense for today. But they just are kind of, it's like the old spy versus spy. You know, you stick your tongue out at them and go, I can do this, and I know you can see me doing it, but you can't do anything about it. So you know, like stick their tongue out. So that's how that's working. Is they're basically, it's a cat and mouse game. If there's good news, China is playing the long game. China has a 70-year strategic plan, right? They don't have like a 2-year. They're not just going to flippantly go off and do something. They're going to think a lot about it, and it's going to go at a slower pace. Russia, on the other hand, is crazy. They will go and do something very fast. So that's why they'll go invade Ukraine without a plan. Okay, well, they did. And now they're in there. And now what do they do? And how do they get out? And what's going to happen? And I'll just keep blowing stuff up. Russia's more flippant when it comes to that. And so even though they have capability, it's not the same as China. And then North Korea is, again, it's another crazy kind of country, right? I think I'll just launch something and see what happens. So thankfully, the two that are more on the flippant side don't have as much capability. China will most likely not want to do a massive World War III with the United States, but they will position. And one of the big questions becomes, will this become something that is warfighting, or will it go to where we were in the 50s, mutually assured destruction? Or we'll just aim stuff at all each other and say, look, don't shoot something at me or I'll shoot something at you and we'll all die.
Yeah.
That is the war that's currently going on. If you read the papers, we're developing our own hyperglide vehicles now and our own hypersonics. That's going towards what we used to call MAD, mutually assured destruction. And so that's one of the huge debates in the government right now. Is it better to invest in a space fence, a space defense system, or is it better to be mutually assured destruction like we were with the Russians many years ago and just say, it's stupid. We'll blow each other up. We'll destroy all mankind. Let's just have a standoff. And we got a Cold War.
Wow.
Don't
Okay.
know, you know, I'm
Yeah,
way over time, but
Yeah.
that's where it looks. And that's
I'd like to try and see if we can get in the last two questions, and then we'll let you go. Madeline, and then Richard, we'll get to you. I promise.
Mine is a small question, and that is, what does L3 stand for in L3 Harris?
it was L3 was actually 3 people's last name.
Names.
And they were 3 L's that came together that developed a company called L3. And at the time they came together, they were almost like venture capital guys. They made a huge amount of purchases of companies and created a holding company of just a lot of little companies, and they called it L3. It was basically a holding of a bunch of venture little companies. And when it combined with Harris is an operational company. And so over time, what we've done is we've moved L3's basically mixed chocolates of all these different kind of systems. We're trying to make it an operational company where it all plays together. So we've sold off a lot of things that didn't fit, and we've integrated the ones that do. But L3 was 3 gentlemen that basically were entrepreneurs, or you know them today as venture capitalists that bought a bunch of companies.
Thank you.
Okay, and last question. We're going to get Richard. We're going to get Richard's question in. He says, "I hear that we cannot tell the truth to the Russian people like the Voice of America. Is it a spectrum problem?"
There are jamming problems and there are spectrum problems. It's like your TV set, right? If you can't turn on ABC because you can't get that spectrum, that's a problem. And so yes, there are, in many countries, they keep the broadcasting from occurring at certain frequencies to keep the people in the dark. That is the benefit of something like a Starlink, where they can talk directly to a satellite. It's much more difficult to jam. Many people like Elon Musk and others, especially OneWeb, they believe that those networks will transform the world because it will bring information to the people who are underserved, who currently are in the dark and don't really know the truth of what's happening. And so they'll be able to get true news and true understanding of what's happening. Now, whether you believe there's true news out there, that's a whole nother category. Because quite honestly, I'm not sure which network you believe, but it's hard to believe they're all reporting the truth. So, but that's what the goal of a lot of these people is, to get true facts into the hands of people across the globe so that they can have true understanding. And right now that is not the case, because you can jam out and not be able, so they can't get American stations, or they can't get those frequencies.
Well, Bill Gattle, thank you so much for your time with us today.
Sure.
Very, very interesting and informative lecture. We really appreciate the time. And thank you all for tuning into the space course. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And I'll be coming back down to Earth in the fall. I'm hoping to bring a course on life forms living under extreme conditions. So please tune back in when I'm back down to Earth in the fall. Thank you. And everybody have a great day. And thanks again for your time with us today, Bill.
Thank you.
All right. Bye now.
Everyone.